the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hi, everybody. How are you? This is Tracy Stuckrath with Thrive Meetings and Events and Eating at a Meeting. And this is our live broadcast every Wednesday, talking about all things food and beverage, where every guest matters and every meal matters. Today on the show, I have from Vancouver, one of my favorite cities in the whole world, is Jackie Suggitt, who is the Stakeholder Engagement Director at ReFed, a nonprofit committed to reducing the $218 billion food waste in the U.S. In her position, she builds and oversees ReFed's diverse network, manages the organization's strategic partnerships, and leads planning for the annual Food Waste Summit. Hello, Jackie.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Okay, so let's just start out with what ReFed is. Can you do that for us?
Sure. Yeah, and you gave a pretty good introduction already, but we're a nonprofit. We work primarily to advance data-driven solutions to food waste across the U.S., but we realize there's a lot of impact areas of food waste as well. So we like to do that in a way that focuses on those impact areas. So optimizing environmental resources, minimizing climate impacts, and then ultimately just making the best use of all the food we grow at the end of the day. And you mentioned the size of the problem already, $218 billion in the US. About 40% of our food goes to waste and never ends up being consumed. And 40% of that 40% comes from consumer-facing businesses, including food service. Another 40% comes from consumers. So this is an issue that I think is relevant to all of us, even as shoppers and consumers, if nothing else.
Well, and my first introduction really to food waste was in 2015 when I went to Milan, spent one day, unfortunately only one day, at the World Summit, or the World Fair. And it was all about food and beverage. And that's why I drove down from Germany for a day and did this. But the first exhibition you walk into was all about food waste. It blew me away. I mean, of how much food is wasted, and we don't think about that, especially as event planners. We are overextending our buffets and making sure there's always food there. And it just blew my mind of how much waste there is in food.
Yeah, it can often be, an invisible problem if you're not aware of it. I'm relatively new to the issue just in the past couple of years. And before that was definitely guilty of just unknowingly wasting food in my own home. Yeah, now that you're conscious and aware, you're suddenly going to be very surprised with how much food waste you see happen.
And even with your own house, those raspberries that you didn't finish eating, or the blueberry, like trying to find, I have 4 pints of blueberries in my refrigerator that I'm like, okay, I'm going to make a blueberry pie so that because they're starting to shrivel up and they're still probably really tasty, but I don't want to eat them like out of my hand, but which is stupid. But anyway, so I found you through Meetingsnet. You're named one of their 2020 event change makers. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And it was about having produced a zero waste event. And I want you to talk about that. Tell the viewers how you guys did that. And one tangent to that, I think, is also kind of fun, is that you personally had never planned an event before.
Right. Yeah. Not at that scale, certainly. Yeah. And a little about the event. It's about 420 people came last year. It was our third annual event. I had not been in charge of it before. This was kind of the largest scale one we'd done. So it was a new experience for me, for sure. A lot of learning curves. I'm not an event planner by trade, so that will be my disclaimer up front. But was a really great opportunity for us to kind of walk the walk. Our stakeholders are all in the food system. And so we wanted food to be a very central event and kind of an experience for people that were attending. And then we felt like we kind of had to have our food waste down, right? If we're having an entire event on food waste. So it was a big priority for us. As you mentioned, it was also kind of our first time. We're a small organization, so we didn't really have rules or precedent that we had to operate it by. We could be really creative in our process. So there's a couple things we did. The first thing we did kind of right off the bat was develop a set of ZeroWaste Event guidelines. At the time, these were more in our head. These have since been put on paper, but these were things that we shared as part of our RFP process with caterers, for example, of here's how we want to handle food. Here's how we want food to be sourced, how we want it to be used, how we want it to be disposed of. That included things like full product utilization, having food donation partners for our excess food, dietary guidelines, reusable or compostable serviceware. We had kind of a set of guidelines we wrote, and we're just very transparent from day one with caterers that kind of here's how we want to operate. And then we found an amazing caterer, Foxtail Catering, just a fabulous partner that we worked with. And they let us work with them in the process. So we brought in upcycled products, for example, for our snacks from some innovators that we work with. We aided a bit in menu design to help with some of that full product utilization. So we'd use kale in some smoothies and then use the leftover kale dried as kale chips for snacks the next day. And so trying to see those products live throughout the event and not end up getting disposed of. And then one of my favorite stories is we used unique sourcing models. So our catering company had a sister company in the Bay Area that essentially provided lunches for some of the local tech offices in the area. Those lunches have very little waste because they're set menus every week. They're in-season products, and they know exactly how many people they're cooking for. So we kind of said, hey, can we add on to one of your deliveries, one of your productions for these companies, and ended up having a zero waste lunch that day because it was ordered so far in advance, the exact number of people, and it was a set menu. So it was a good story to tell for our attendees too.
Right.
Like, here's why you only have one option at lunch today, and it's because it's something that is leading to zero waste. So yeah, we were able to kind of mix and blend a lot of different ideas to try and creatively get to as little waste as possible for the event.
And and that takes a lot of collaboration. And I'm glad that the catering partner was willing to partner to do that with you. But I think that's one of the processes too, is for planners, is finding that partner that's willing to do it. Because there's a lot of properties that will come back. No, well, we can't do this. This is not possible. And so how did you transition that to, or did you just find the right partner that was like, yeah, we want to do this?
Yeah, and we were operating in a situation where we got to choose our caterer, which I know isn't always the case. But because of that, as I said, we were very transparent from our first conversations with, here's how we want to see this happen, and we want to see this show up in the proposals of like how this is going to work. Mm-hmm. And so by the time we got those, we kind of knew what our options were. But we also work with a lot of food recovery organizations in general. So had our catering partner not had an established relationship, which they already did, we've got a vast network across the country of organizations that work in food recovery and specialize in events, for example. And so that's a public resource as well, if that's helpful. But that's something that we could have brought to the caterers as well, just to help with establishing those partnerships. But in this case, they already had a great partnership with an organization called Copia, who handled all of the pickup of the leftover food and kind of same day delivery to a local nonprofit.
All right. Yeah, I have to Google that and tag them on here too. So we're in the middle of COVID, and planners aren't really planning anything right now, any kind of food and beverage. But I posted an article from Meetingsnet this morning. It's like, this is the time to plan and innovate. So I know your guidelines, the event guidelines are not up there, but what can planners do now during COVID? Well, so two questions. What can planners do now to plan with COVID? And then the other question is, how is COVID affecting food waste? So two separate conversations. Sure.
Well, on the first one, I think, as you say, it's, dare I say, not as busy of a time for some of us. I know it's busier for others, but so I do think advanced planning is a key part of that. Another interesting way to think about it is, like I said, 40% of that food waste happens in consumer homes. So we're all living in our own mini event spaces right now too. And so I think there's just an awareness that we can be practicing in our own homes. I think we're all understanding the value of food a little more these days as we're hearing stories about milk being dumped and animals being culled. I think a lot of us are walking through grocery stores, or at least were, with empty shelves. So hopefully we're all more aware of that food to begin with, and we can be starting to practice some of that awareness in our own homes and understanding things like, what do date labels mean, and how can I plan meals, and how do I store food properly? And hopefully that appreciation then can then carry over once we start getting back into public and larger spaces, and we can all have that awareness in those types of venues as well.
Yeah. And just kind of the awareness, the one thing that I've seen with COVID going on right now is not only it's the masks and making sure, fewer people die from this, but it's feeding people.
Yes.
And I mean, that's the thing that you see on TV, schools coming together and people coming and bringing food to the schools to give out to students and things like that. And World Central Kitchen is all about feeding people. And because right now, there are a lot of people that can't afford food, and the food bank numbers have skyrocketed by 300%, but so have farm boxes. A lot of my farmer friends, their CSA programs have just skyrocketed as well. So good thing.
Even before COVID, we were living in a world already where we were wasting 40% of this food, but we had a very large food insecure population, not only around the world, but in the US. And so I think that both of those issues now have been exacerbated a bit with COVID, where we're seeing additional food go to waste, or at least additional food waste in certain parts of the supply chain. At the same time, like you said, we're seeing huge demand increases on the food access side. So if you think about, and I could spend a whole hour talking on the supply chain implications, which I won't, but in brief, I think some of the impacts that we've seen COVID have on the food system. You mentioned farm, and it really goes back to farm. And I think that was drastic in the beginning because we already had crops in the ground when this thing started, right? And you can't just halt a 6-week or a 2-month growing season. And so we saw a lot of waste happening as entire sectors, including events, including airlines, including hotels, is completely shut down. And that food no longer having a home to go to. But our overall demand didn't decrease, right? We're still feeding the same number of people. We're just feeding them in different places. But those supply chains didn't exist. So we saw huge waste on farms happening, certainly not because of anything the farmers were doing wrong, just in these supply chain shifts. Yep. And then in restaurant and food service, right off the bat, we saw a lot of waste with one-time closures or event cancellations. And again, just completely new models having to shift out of that. And then you already mentioned food banks. We're seeing 70% up to 300% increases in demand, depending on the food bank that you're talking about. I think we've all seen news stories now with the mile-long lines of cars that are waiting there. And these food banks are strapped for labor because they have social distancing measures now in place. So they have fewer volunteers. They don't have the right packaging because they're getting in the 50-pound bags of flour from restaurants that, I'm not going to go buy a 50-pound bag of flour. They wouldn't even have a place to store it. And then as consumers, we're acting totally different, right? We're shopping once a week now, maybe, instead of a couple times a week. And we're not frequenting the same places we used to. So it's just a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty, and trying to balance that supply and demand shift in a whole new way.
Yeah. And what I found interesting in one of the stories is that, getting it from the farm into the grocery store or to the people from food service to that is what you mentioned is the different packaging sizes. Yeah. And it's not an easy fix. Yeah. And even when all of these, okay, Cooper, shush. I'm at my friend Katie's house, and so now I have a dog. So, trying to change the supply chain route to get it there, to feed the right people is really challenging. And who would have thought, right?
Yeah. And the fun part of that, though, is you're seeing a lot of innovation, right? Yeah. And people doing things different. we just hosted a webinar last week, and one of our guests was Chef Tracy from a restaurant called Pagoo in the Northeast. And they actually started repackaging stuff like that. They'd bring in the huge tons of flour and repackage it into smaller containers and then end up selling it. They're now kind of a grocery store, essentially, right? So you're seeing a lot of innovation. You're seeing a lot of creativity. You're seeing just a lot of, I think, some of the positive sides of humanity and trying to figure out the solutions to these issues. We all need to eat. I think we all knew that hunger and food insecurity was an issue, but it's suddenly a lot more visible or personal for us now than it was a couple months ago.
Yeah, especially for people who never thought they would be utilizing a food bank except to go support it and volunteer. Now they're actually the users of it, which is a very big shift in mentality. I have all these questions that we talked about, and I feel like we've already talked a lot about it. But I like the fact that the perspective that you had going back to having not been a planner and looking at it differently. So not having preconceived notions of how things would work. Do you think that really helped you plan that event?
I think so. Well, it probably hindered me in some ways too. I'm sure there's a lot of advice other people that are perhaps listening to this could have given me to do it better than I did. But I think there was some advantage of maybe not having some of those preconceived notions. I know one of the things we had talked about previously, Tracy, was around some of the meal attrition calculations. And so that's one where, I didn't know the industry standards. And so as we were kind of talking through that, as I had mentioned, this was about 420 people at the event. It was a full day and 2 half days. And so we were pretty aggressive as far as how we cut down those numbers. Our peak meal, like our single meal that we planned most for, we planned for 350, but the others were all like 180 to 220 that we planned and actually like ordered food for. Just assuming, again, the attrition, people eating other places, people not actually eating a full portion size. We also, being a food waste organization, it was an easier story for us to tell of like, oh, look, we ran out of food. Here's why, instead of like having mounds of food left over. So it was kind of a risk we were willing to take. Obviously, we didn't want to run out of food, and no one did end up going hungry. We had plenty of food to go around. Later learned that kind of, normal surpluses at a conference like this, we were told kind of 20 to 25% from the planning organization that we worked with. Ours was 7%.
Wow.
At the end of the day. So we had 27 pounds of food left over at the end of the event. That's what Copia picked up and took to a local foundation that same day. But everyone was fed. Everyone was happy. I think for us, it was a great learning experience, but it was also just, I think, a great partnership opportunity, again, with the caterer and with others to say, how can we tell a different story and just do this a little different, and let's see what happens.
And that's amazing. And were your... because I went to an event with Streamline Events. I actually spoke at an event for them, and they're San Francisco based. And they did a lunch, and they served 1/3 of the people plated meals, 1/3 was family style, and 1/3 was buffet. At the end of the event, they showed the amount of waste from each one of those different service styles, and it's mind blowing.
It is.
Plated is very limited on how much waste there is. And then the buffet is definitely, higher than the family style, but it taught those planners to think differently.
Yeah. And there's also some, and there's pros and cons to both. The downside with plated is you don't know if people eat everything on their plates. Right. And so there's a lot of kind of strategies. And I think you shared or may have shared that we have an action guide for food service as far as ways to reduce food waste. There's some recommendations in there, and even things that we did. So we didn't have pre-plated meals. It was a level of self-serve again. So people were only taking what they wanted, but we had limited quantities out of the time. So we never had kind of a full plate of, bagels or chicken or whatever. It was kind of brought out in stages. Again, partially because food that wasn't already out was better able to donate if it was still back of house, as well as just controlling the consumption levels. Other things like using smaller plates. And, people often won't eat an entire plate size full of food, but we often fill the plates. If you're like me, I fill the plate, whatever size I have. And so using things like smaller plates, there's a lot of different kind of just more environmental strategies, like consumer environment, strategies that can help to not reduce consumption as far as make people starve, but just help control consumption to what people are actually going to eat at the end of the day.
And I think that's a thing that we all consciously need to personally realize. I'm like, am I going to really eat all of that food?
Especially when it looks so good. I just take one of each.
Yeah, exactly. And so, don't take what your eyes and your stomach, take what you actually know you're going to consume instead. But that's a learning thing for us as well.
Yeah.
And so changing the mentality of the attendees. You mentioned at the very, very beginning, so data-driven. So besides the statistic of $218 billion of food waste, what other data are you showing and helping organizations realize that can help them grasp on and jump onto this campaign?
Yeah, great question. I think, for a lot of us, you mentioned even people filling their plates in buffets, food waste doesn't really register as being something I have to care about. I think we have this vision of we throw it away and it goes in compost somewhere and it doesn't become an issue. But there's actually huge environmental implications of food waste. When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, it's a huge just filler of our landfills, and it doesn't actually go away in a landfill, right? It's going to stay there and release those emissions. So awareness is just a big thing we try and do in general as far as those implications of food waste. As far as the data work that we do, we do a lot of work around quantifying the problem in the US as far as how much goes to waste. We do a lot around talking about why it goes to waste and where it goes. And perhaps most importantly, we talk about what are the solutions. There's a global commitment right now, as well as a national commitment to cut food waste in half by 2030. Okay. And so one of our main missions is trying to show people how we do that. So we have a set of solutions that we do full economic analyses on as far as what will it cost, what's the social economic benefit, how many jobs will it create, how much emissions will it reduce for these set of solutions. That's available in our roadmap, which is another tool, I think, Tracy, that you may have shared or is available on our website.
Yep.
And we're actually very excited. This November, we're going to be launching a tool called the Insights Engine, which essentially is the next iteration of that roadmap. It'll be a digital tool. Anyone can go on and say, I work in food service, or I'm a retailer. What are the things that I can be doing to reduce food waste? And you can understand what's the size of the problem in your sector. Why is food waste happening in your sector? Where's it going? What's the set of, what are the top 3 solutions that, you could go do and reduce that? So that's our mission. Hopefully this fall is to have that tool available to where we can be making this much more applicable and action-oriented for people who are new into the issue, to understand it quickly and know almost immediately, here's a set of strategies you can be implementing to help reduce food waste, which in many cases also saves money and feeds more people and reduces environmental impacts. So there's a lot of different benefits to doing that.
When I talk food allergies, and that's a whole nother conversation that we can bring up momentarily, I have this circle. It says the event food chain, and whose responsibility is it to manage dietary needs? And it starts with the attendee and the planner and the convention catering services manager and the chef and the sous chefs and the banquet captains. But same thing with food waste and all of this, every single one of those people has a responsibility to understand it and to help minimize it, right? And banquet captain, you don't want to go up to Jackie and say, Jackie, you haven't finished what's on your plate. You need to eat it. Not my mom. But, I think with the plan that you have, does it show everybody what their role is?
Yeah, it's going to, especially at a sector level, I think, show where that responsibility is. And there's different levels of food waste at every sector. But I think you make another good point, which is there's a risk here that food waste is everyone's responsibility, so it's no one's responsibility, right? It's kind of one of those issues. And so one of the things we talk about within an organization, kind of within a single organization, is it's really important to have an internal champion. That's often either a leader based on their position in the organization or just a social leader within the organization who can really be a champion of that, because it does require a lot of collaboration across different teams. I come from retail as my background, and there's a dozen different teams within a retailer that are involved with food waste reduction. And so it requires that collaboration, which often requires someone to be stepping up as kind of that internal champion to make it happen.
Yeah, and it has to come from the top down as well, from that CEO level.
Right. Yep. Hey, priorities.
Yep. And so building it in. My friend Kristen worked at a grocery store, and she was doing the same thing as educating all of the team members on their responsibility and managing it and creating that sustainability practices, which you would think at a grocery store, you would have that too, but you don't. I mean, it's still education for everybody to understand.
Yes, there's education that needs to happen for consumers, for employees. As I mentioned, I'm new to the issue, and I've been educated a lot in the past few years about things I've been doing just completely unintentionally that are, wasting unnecessary food and ultimately making me spend more money on groceries every week. So
right, yeah. I mean, and just thinking about what rots in your refrigerator before you finish eating it, and reusing it. It reminds me, my friend Steven Satterfield, he owns a restaurant, Miller Union in Atlanta. And love him. And he's on, James Beard and working on their food waste reduction program as well. But he's like, in culinary school, you took the carrot and you cut all four sides off, so you could make it a perfect square to make the dice and all of that. And you just threw it in the trash can. All the sides you cut off. And now he's like, no, what can I do with those four sides of the carrot or the stalk of the kale that you're not using? How can you reutilize that to make something else?
Yeah. And that's actually one of the more fun strategies I think that we brought into the summit. And I think our caterers loved thinking about was we don't want any inedible parts, as they're often thought of, in food to go to waste. Even the carrot tops, those greens are edible. They're great in a salad, right? And so
they make great pesto too.
And yes, great pesto. And so that was one thing that was kind of fun in the planning, was saying, okay, we're going to be using parts of kale for this or parts of carrot for this. Where can we see it go elsewhere? And we brought carrots into a carrot gnocchi dish one night. And so there's a lot of ways where you can take, what we would typically think of as waste and actually make it into something awesome. And you're not having to source additional food for it. It's delicious. It's often nutritious because it is things like the greens or like the shavings off of fruits and vegetables. It takes a little more work to do that, but it's a great story to tell. I think people love seeing that as consumers at an event. And then ultimately is a really powerful waste reduction tool.
Okay, so I have no idea why this popped into my head, but like pits of peaches and cherries. I mean, is that just literally waste, or can you do something?
Yeah, there actually are inedible parts of food in some cases, although there are some chefs that will challenge you on that and take the challenge to try and make things edible. But yes, pits, bones out of meat.
Right.
In many cases, rinds. Sometimes rinds are edible, sometimes they're not, or just you don't want to eat them. Right. So yeah, there are actual inedible parts, and that's where solutions like composting come in, or rendering for kind of meat products. So yeah, there are solutions for those still at the end of the day, but it's not usually human consumption.
One word that you mentioned earlier was upstream, and you did that for your breaks at the
upcycling.
Upcycling, yeah. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So we work with a lot of wonderful innovators that will take food that seems to be inedible and turn it into something that is edible. Okay. So, grain waste from breweries being turned into part of a snack bar, for example. And so we had several of these innovators that make snacks essentially out of upcycled food. And so we partnered with a lot of them with our caterer as well for the event to say, hey, we'd love to actually allow these organizations to highlight their products and the story behind upcycled food and offer them as snacks throughout the event. And so we did bring in some of those external products as well, just to show it's kind of a new concept. I think we've been doing it for a long time, but as consumers, we're new to the idea of upcycled food. And it's a great story. People love it and they taste wonderful. So,
okay. So I just went onto the dictionary and I looked it up and I'm going to put it up here.
There's a great organization called the Upcycled Food Association as well. That's new. They've just officially defined what upcycled food means. And they're doing a lot of work to kind of advance those products. Okay.
So, and the dictionary says reuse in such a way as to create a product of higher quality or value than the original. I mean, that's a great way to look at it.
Yep. I mean, something that would be wasted now is for a business is a profitable product. But for consumers is a new product to eat. And
it was the Upcycled Food, what?
Upcycled Food Association.
Food association. Okay. Who knew there's an association for everything?
It's true.
Which that's a good thing for what we've got, because there's so many different caveats of food that we don't think about. And it is the one thing that I say all the time is James Beard food is our common ground. It's our universal experience. And it's, I think we talked about it. It's our number one budget expenditure. I say that too. And it's probably the thing that we take for granted the most when we're planning an event or we're making something at home. And I think that's a shame.
It is. And I think food is such a cultural necessity. There's obviously physical needs we all have to stay alive, but beyond that, I think it's a social and cultural necessity that really helps to bring people together. So we need to be building an inclusive and sustainable system to allow us to keep doing that. And maybe one of the side benefits of this, horrible experience we're going through globally right now in the pandemic is hopefully an appreciation of that food and of that system, and just the fragility of that system, and what we can all be doing to bring a little bit of sustainability and equity into that.
And one last question. So a couple of stories on the Today Show this week were that food prices are going up, and that's going to impact. That's going to be even harder hit when a lot of us are, furloughed or not working and don't have the money to do it. But can this whole managing food waste help reduce those costs or lower those costs back down?
It can. Yeah, it takes a little bit of investment of time and sometimes resources up front. But again, it's kind of the simple math of if you're using more of it and wasting less of it, true of any product or commodity, you're having to buy less, right? And it obviously gets a little more complex than that in the food system because we're planting months and months ahead of consumption. So there's not necessarily a direct path back. There's a lag in that supply and demand. But I think just as a best practice, we can all be reducing less waste, which will in turn, at a macro level, I think make that a more sustainable and affordable system.
Yeah. And it's baby steps, everybody can do their little part and we can all be a solution for it in the end.
Yep. It's everyone's problem, everyone's responsibility, but there's absolutely something we can all do, which is empowering, I think.
It very much is. So I've already posted the things that I said, what are your go-to resources? So my last question for you is, what is your favorite food and drink?
Oh boy. I'm a sucker for Mexican food. I love.
I think everybody is.
I know. It's kind of a cop-out answer, isn't it?
No, okay.
My guilty pleasure, though, which I actually feel no guilt about, is a double stuffed Oreo and ice cold milk. That is like my go-to comfort food of choice.
And do you pick up when all the different flavors of it come out? Do you?
Nope. I'm a purist. I just like my double stuffed plain Oreos. I don't mess with the peanut butter or the mint or whatever else is out there.
And you pick them apart, or do you eat them whole?
Nope, just eat it whole. Yeah.
You are a true purist. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate it. Is there anything parting words that you want to say to people?
No, just I really appreciate being on today. I think it's fun to relive these types of experiences when we're all kind of living without them these days. And so just hope that we can all continue to prepare for the future that will someday come. And stay optimistic, and definitely look forward to getting out there and learning way more about event planning than I already know from so many of the experts kind of within this network.
Well, yeah, reach out to us. We're happy to help, and I'm engaged. I will help you guys with ReFed in any way that I can.
Well, thank you, Tracy.
You're welcome, Jackie. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.